My task is to talk about the Eighth Army. In the United Kingdom, the Eighth Army has a very, very, very big reputation. It was between 1940 and 1943, effectively, it was the only British Army formation that was making any progress whatsoever in the war against Germany. And the Eighth Army's reputation was essentially made by that bloke, Bernard Montgomery. General Montgomery became commander of the Eighth Army in the summer of 1942, a man who's actually of Irish descent, who came family from Northern Ireland. And he was appointed desperately, the British Army and Churchill, we just hadn't had a single victory. And he led the British Army to what was essentially the first victory of the Second World War, which is the Battle of El Alamein. And it was that battle which made his reputation, and he eventually became an Earl Montgomery of El Alamein, and he became Britain's most famous commander, probably the most famous commander since Wellington. So, enormous reputation. And the Eighth Army's reputation went through the roof. The Desert Rats, they were called. So, the Eighth Army was the principal component of Britain's contribution to the Italian campaign. And what it was multinational right from the beginning. So you didn't only have British soldiers, you had New Zealand soldiers, you had Indian soldiers, in North Africa you had South African soldiers. And this was a problem right from the beginning. Anybody who's done any military training know it's almost impossible to operate coherently with forces who don't necessarily speak the same language or don't use the same equipment. The British Army used the same equipment. So right from the beginning of the Italian campaign, it had a major problem in terms of getting these national forces. And they had the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Poles who eventually joined the Eighth Army. And as we heard, the Italian forces were in the Eighth Army under the Polish command. And the problem there for the Eighth Army was that the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the South Africans were all mainly volunteers. And their generals were reporting, they were effectively the representatives of the government of those countries. So the commander of the Canadian forces, he basically reported to the Prime Minister of Canada. The commander of the New Zealand division reported to the New Zealand government. So the ability to operate coherently was compromised right from the beginning, and the truth of the matter is that the Italian campaign for the Eighth Army was a bit anti-climax after the triumphs. And it was just as well for Bernard Montgomery that he left the Eighth Army at the end of 1943 and went back to Britain to be a commander in the D-Day operation, where success was enormous and reputations were not damaged, leaving Oliver Leese to take the bane of the problems that follow for the next 18 months. Now, there were other problems for the Eighth Army. And the first problem was not the terrain, it wasn't the Germans, it wasn't the technology, it wasn't even the multinational force. It was politics, right from the beginning. That was the problem the Eighth Army had. And the first problem the Eighth Army had were those three. Those are the big problems. Everything the Eighth Army did in Italy was shaped by those guys. And on the right, Winston Churchill, deemed to be the saviour of Britain and the greatest hero of British history, in fact was the biggest problem for the Eighth Army in Italy. He was the one who wanted to go to Italy. Nobody else really did. He's the one who insisted that Rome should be captured by the end of the year, when it really wasn't possible. He's the one who wanted Operation Shingle in Anzio, which nobody thought could work. And and the worst part about Churchill is that for about 3 months, he wasn't sitting in London. He'd come out to the Mediterranean to check out the generals were doing well, and then he got ill, and he spent 2 months in North Africa, just down the road. So all the commanders on the Eighth Army were constantly being pestered by him. He was saying, why aren't you winning the war? Get on with it, attack something, capture Rome. He was the biggest problem. The second problem was the one sitting next to him. It was President Roosevelt, hero of the Second World War. Why was he a problem? Because he agreed with everything Winston Churchill suggested. They had a personal relationship. Winston Churchill and Roosevelt would sit up late in the night, smoking cigars, drinking brandy, talking rubbish, and Winston Churchill was like to play up. He was half American. His mother was American. And he manipulated Roosevelt. And with the result that the commanders under Roosevelt were consistently told to do things that they didn't want to do, including invading the mainland of Italy. And the third problem is the other guy. Does anybody know who the third one in that picture is? You all know that's Joseph Stalin. Now, he was a problem because that photograph was taken in Tehran. I've been there. This was the first big summit, the Big Three. He called the Big Three. Winston Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin sitting together planning the future of the war, Europe, and the post-World War. In that meeting in Tehran, guess what they agreed? They agreed that the border of Poland should be shifted west. You heard about that? Why was Eastern Poland taken away? It was taken away by the decision taken in Tehran. By those three guys. It wasn't just one. Three of them agreed. You know, so that was the problem. The reason why Stalin was the problem is the man in the middle, Roosevelt, knew there was no possibility of America winning the war in time for the next election in America in 1944 without Stalin. They had to have Stalin on board. Otherwise, Roosevelt's going to lose the election. And the Republicans can come in and come out of the war. He staked his entire reputation on winning the war by 1944. The fact he didn't do it by 44 wasn't the intent. He had been elected in 1942 to do what? To keep America out of the war. He was elected in 1940. He was elected to keep America out of the war. He said, I will not send American boys to foreign wars. He's opened his mouth, he said those words, but he did. So he subverted his whole original intention that he was elected on, and he had to win the war by 44. By any and all means possible, including nuclear weapons. That was politics. And all the people like Dan's dad, my dad, your father, their lives were affected by those three. So politics was the number one issue, and it's complicated further initially by two other factors. General Charles de Gaulle. General Charles de Gaulle in 1940, when France surrendered or gave up, was an obscure junior officer in the French army. Why did he become, by 1944, the face of France, recognized eventually as the leader of the Free French? Why? It's because Winston Churchill didn't want to do a deal with the Vichy government and declared the Vichy government to be a legitimate government, and therefore had to have another French government regime to deal with. And Charles de Gaulle was the one they chose. Little did they know that Charles de Gaulle was also one of the most anti-British people ever produced by France, and not least in part because he's part Irish. Not many people know that. And Charles de Gaulle, by the summer of 44 now, had emerged as being the premier leader of the Free French. Not recognized as the government, well, they were beginning to be recognized by the government. And Charles de Gaulle, this time, 80 years ago, was in Italy. He was coming to Italy. He was based in Algiers, which was then French territory. He was coming to Italy to check the progress of the French Expeditionary Corps because he wanted the French army to be part of the victorious coalition. And that is why the Italian campaign was fought with such ferocity by the French Expeditionary Corps. Because the man at the top told General Join, he said, whatever you can do, you're going to have to win. And you're going to have to win big, and you're going to have to use whatever method you use. And history tells a story about what the result of that political decision was. And it's a memory that is still bitter in this part of Italy. And the other person I'm going to mention is this guy. Does anybody know who that is? Harold Macmillan. Harold Macmillan, after the war, became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. At the same time as President Eisenhower was president. President Eisenhower was Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean at this just before. So in the end of 43, Eisenhower was there, and Macmillan was there. They were close personal friends. So two men in the end that led the United Kingdom, the United States post-war, forged an alliance and partnership in North Africa in the Italian campaign. Now, Harold Macmillan is probably the most left-wing prime minister Britain's ever had. The reason I say that is because that's what Clement Attlee said. It wasn't Ramsay MacDonald or any of those lefties, it was actually him. Very radical man. But one of the things that he had, which was shared by Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, I've got to use the word exactly, contempt for Italy. Contempt for Italy. And the reason why Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden and Harold Macmillan had contempt for Italy is because of what happened in June 1940. And they took it personally. They took it personally because, and the Munich Agreement, when the attempt was made to reach peace, Mussolini helped broker that deal. And they felt personally betrayed by Italy, which had been our ally in the First World War. Our ally. And it was personal. And you can see it from the letters from Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, when he authorized, with Winston Churchill's support, indiscriminate bombing of Italian towns to win the war. It's recorded in the record that Anthony Eden said, "We will bomb Italy out of the war by deliberately hitting civilian targets," and that started in 1942. So people talk about the weather, they talk about the geography, they talk about everything else. They should be talking about these guys. Because without these guys, there wouldn't have been an Italian campaign, and there wouldn't have been the destruction we saw. These are the people who make decisions. And there's a lesson in history for this. You've got to watch out who's in charge of your governments. Now, the second problem was D-Day. Now, D-Day in Britain and America is celebrated. It's a great moment of liberation. It's a fantastic opportunity. We celebrate it with joy, but we don't seem to pay as much attention to the Italian campaign, which went on longer and which actually was the training ground. It was the training ground for British forces, American forces. Probably every commander who went on command in D-Day learnt their art in Sicily and Italy. Patton learnt it in Sicily. It's a training ground, but we don't sing and dance about it. D-Day is the one we want to talk about. Of course we want to talk about it because it was a tremendous success, but the reality is, doing D-Day took all the resources, or most of it, out of the Italian campaign and ensured the Italian campaign would just go on and on and on and on and on and on, and thousands of Italians died of starvation and disease because of it. So from Italy's point of view, D-Day was a disaster. If there hadn't been D-Day and all the focus had been on the Italian campaign, it would have been finished sooner. Italy would have been finished out of the war. So I'm reversing the logic that's usually presented. Do you see the pattern? Winston Churchill's a hero. No, he's not in Italy. D-Day was great, but actually not for Italy. So what next in this startling? The geography, indisputably, and that is a picture of what my dad was looking at for 2 months, which is the Monte Cassino Massif. There are at least 20 places like that. The 8th Army, the 5th Army had to take. Frankly, impossible. No sensible person would try it. Any training of senior officer told, attack those places, they said, don't do it. Just don't do it, do something else. But they did it, and they did it for month after month after month after month after month to the end of the war. So what other problems did the 8th Army have? The Americans. We love you. And I'm going to put a picture up here of a man really who should be better known in America than he actually is. That is General Mark Clark. At the time, the youngest major general in the American Army, an outstanding personality, a great brain. His mother was Jewish. You read his diaries. I mean, he's an eloquent, educated, highly trained man, well regarded by General Eisenhower. But he's often treated as the one. You talk to Americans and Brits, they damn this guy. They say this guy was hopeless, he was the Rapido River, they blame him for everything. You know, the British reporters say he was very showing off in Rome in May 1945. I would show up in Rome on the 4th of June 1945 if my army had captured the first Western capital, liberated the first one. An army of 400,000 men had been slogging up this pointless battle from Salerno. I'd show off too, because he felt that if he didn't show off, what would his men feel about it, who've suffered and paid the price? What would the families feel? What would the people in America feel, having spent all this money and lost all these lives, if they just backed into Rome? I don't blame him or an American soldier. The American problem was, from a British point of view, if you're in the British 8th Army, and you, first of all, you've been to public school, and you're rather posh, you have a problem with these rough and tumble, egalitarian Americans who, with all their fancy ideas, telling you didn't know what you're doing. Well, I didn't even say that, or not listening to the experience of centuries of empire. That was the first problem, and that was a rigged problem. And actually, Mark Clark was incredibly rude about Alexander. In fact, he wrote, I think today, 80 years ago, the 8th Army did no fighting. He wrote it in his diary. Now, my dad would have been upset with that one. But what the reality was, that Italy showed the future for Britain and the British Empire. The future had arrived in Italy. It had arrived in the landing craft, in the flying fortresses, in the avalanche of trucks, that the future was no longer British. The British Empire's days were finished. They were going to become irrelevant, and the new power in the world is going to be America. And you can see in the accounts, the British accounts on it, it's one of the reasons why the Italian campaign really doesn't get the attention. Because the British prefer not to talk about it, because in the end, it was essentially the British role in it became increasingly small. And it was the bulk of the 5th Army led by Mark Clark who eventually secured the victory. In May, when the war has ended, who did the Germans sign with? And salute, they went to Mark Clark and Lucien Truscott, the photograph's there. So we don't really want to remember stuff like that if you're British. We prefer to talk about Waterloo, That's another problem. And the last problem, and I think that's the least of the problem they had, was actually the Germans. The truth of the matter is the Germans, their approach, I mean, it's in the books that say the Germans were determined and resilient, they were Nazis and they were kind of beside themselves for that. No, they weren't. Most of them conscripts, many of them weren't even German, they were Poles. And given the chance to surrender, they did. I mean, the problem wasn't the Germans, they were being told what to do. The problem was that the 8th Army was being told to do an impossible job with an obscure objective by people miles away who were thinking about their political priorities. Now, what was a good thing for the 8th Army? Let's go. I'm going the wrong way, sorry. I'm looking for the good thing. What was the best thing? Assistance. The best thing in Italy campaign was, in fact, they were fighting against Hitler and Mussolini. Without Hitler and Mussolini, with a couple of leaders of Germany and Italy, it wouldn't have been fought here. It wouldn't have been fought the same way. And Mussolini and Hitler combined came up with the most bonkers approach to what they were doing, sacrificing incredible amounts of lives, equipment, pointlessly. So thank God, if you're in the 8th Army, you should say thank God for Hitler and Mussolini, because you really helped us in the end secure the victory that we got. And of course, the second great assistant is the Allied soldiers. People like Daniel's dad, like your dad, and people here who had fathers. These are the guys who did it, for goodness sake. And they put up with the most impossible conditions. And most of them never got over it. And my father never celebrated the victory in Italy because he thought it was a waste. And he lamented every brick that was knocked down by an Italian home. He was horrified by the conditions the Italian people reduced him to. The humiliation imposed upon an entire nation, one of the most civilized nations in the world, humiliated, degraded by occupying forces and the depredations they brought with them and the horrors inflicted upon the Italian people, which means, in the end, above everyone else, the real heroes of the Italian campaign, and the point of this conference, And the purpose of what I'm doing is to celebrate the real heroes, who are the people of Italy. And we heard about them today, didn't we? We heard about what your father did. We heard about what Federico was saying about the Arditi. We heard from Mark Howard, who spoke about the unbelievable generosity of penniless peasants with nothing, whose homes were being shelled, their boys were in prison. We heard from Nick Young about what the Italian people did for your dad. I'm here to tell this story because this is what I believe is true. The 8th Army would never have won. The 5th Army would never have won. The Allies would have never have won Italy without the assent and support of the Italian people that operated often below the screens in the most smallest possible ways, providing a little bit of food, giving my dad hot water to have a wash with, maintaining their morale, and generally putting up with the rubbish that was inflicted upon them for 2 horrible years. And the Italian people are the hero of this story. And that is the purpose of what the Freedom of Italy is doing. This is Italy's story, for Italy, by Italy. And it's time, well probably on time, that I believe that a new approach to this Italian story. James, the story of those heroes who resisted at the gates of Rome against impossible odds. These are the heroes of the Italian campaign, the real heroes. And look at those faces of the men and women. Look at their faces. Now, look at the emotions on their faces. They have put up with months and months of deprivation. They've had to put up with Italian fascism. They've been starved and bombed. This is Naples, the most heavily bombed city in Europe, bombed by Allied bombers. And look at their faces. Look at the children. Couldn't that be my grandchild? Look at that woman. Couldn't she be my mother? And this is a moment, a beginning, not an end, a beginning. A hope returned. And that's their story. And they deserve full, total, and complete respect because they came through and produced people like Alessandro Schiolari, who's made this possible, and to Ruggiero and Alessandro Campagna. I can list hundreds and hundreds of names of Italians who've helped this project be possible and ask for nothing, just your attention and a dose of truth. So anyway, the conference now closed, and I have to thank everybody here. Some are still here and some aren't. I want to thank all the speakers. I mean, it's been a consistently brilliant conference. This afternoon has been as good as any part of it. And I want to thank, of course, the Mayor of Anzio and the Mayor in Nettuno, the representatives. I want to thank the Chief of the Joint Defence Staff. I want to thank General Bella, if he's still here, and the radio team. I want to thank those wonderful children, school kids who came and read their letters. I want to thank the business people who are backing what we're doing. I want to thank the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the American Battle Monuments Commission and the French Cemeteries Commission who were there here yesterday, and the Polish Museum. I want to thank them. I want to thank our representatives from the Museums of Italy who came a long way to share their story, all volunteers. I want to thank our wonderful Italian team this morning, particularly Ruggiero here, who told a fabulous story. I want to thank our international experts, Antoine, is he still here? I want to thank him from France. Thank you for doing, oh yeah, Christian, thank you, from the French War Graves submission. I want to thank him. I want to thank Professor Pasquale. I want to thank Michele Di Leonardo, who is actually sitting still, and I think he's asleep, for taking fabulous photographs all the time, non-stop energy. I want to thank him. And I want to thank our speakers this afternoon, James McFarlane, Federico Civittoni, Daniel, Mark, James, what a presentation. But I want to thank the people of Anzio and Nettuno for their hospitality. I want to thank Alessandro Schiolari, whose vision inspired what we've done over the last 2 days on ASSO Knowledge and your team. But above all, I want to thank you all. It's been great the last 2 days. Thank you so much. We will be back with another great initiative on the Freedom for Italy initiative. So we'll be reaching out to you, I hope. Don't just trash the email when it arrives. I want to thank Bob DeSurdis, of course, who set out the Freedom for Italy program and explained it yesterday so clearly. Is another one of the partners in this project. So We will be back with something else in due course. No compulsion, it's non-profit, non-commercial. We're doing it because we love doing it and because we want to make sure the story is never forgotten. We are your partners, we are your collaborators, we are your friends, and if we're irritating sometimes, please forgive us. Patro Quattro, of course. Your wonderful presentation for the Coast Guards today. That was absolutely fabulous.
And one more person we need to thank, for his boundless energy, knowledge, and enthusiasm to make this happen to you. Here, here.
You're trying to make me cry. Bloody easy. Well, that's it. So I hope we'll be gathering today. Thank you. Good luck in everything you do, and God bless you all for the future.